There is something uniquely haunting about a child who goes off to school one morning and simply never comes home. But when that child disappears during what was supposed to be an exciting adventure, a field trip filled with laughter and learning and the promise of memories to last a lifetime, the tragedy cuts even deeper. Tonight, we explore some of the most chilling cases of students who left for school trips and were never seen again, or who returned forever, changed by what they experienced. It was a sweltering July afternoon in 1976 in Chowchilla, California, a small farming town of about 5,000 people nestled in the San Joaquin Valley, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where doors were left unlocked, and where the biggest worry most parents had was whether their children would get sunburned at the community pool. On July 15th of that year, 26 children between the ages of 5 and 14 had spent the day doing exactly that, splashing around at the Chowchilla Fairgrounds swimming pool as part of a summer school program at Dairyland Elementary School. It was the kind of day that felt endless in the best possible way, the sort of memory that children carry with them into adulthood as proof that summer really was as magical as they remembered. By approximately 4 in the afternoon, the children were tired and happy, their skin still smelling of chlorine as they climbed aboard the familiar yellow school bus driven by 55-year-old Edward Ray, known to everyone simply as Ed. Ed had been driving school buses in Chowchilla for years and was beloved by the children and parents alike. He was the kind of man who remembered every child's name, who told corny jokes to break the ice with nervous kindergartners, and who took his responsibility for those children as seriously as any sacred duty. The route home was a familiar one, winding through the rural roads that connected the fairgrounds to the small neighborhoods where the children lived. But on this particular afternoon, something was different. As Ed guided the bus along Avenue 21, a white van suddenly appeared in the road ahead, blocking their path completely. Ed brought the bus to a halt, perhaps assuming there had been an accident or a breakdown. But before he could make sense of what was happening, 3 men emerged from the van wearing nylon stockings over their faces and carrying weapons. What happened next would become the largest mass kidnapping in American history and would forever change how parents across the nation thought about the safety of their children. The 3 masked men moved quickly and with apparent rehearsal. One of them pointed a gun directly at Ed Ray, while another took control of the bus's steering wheel. The third followed in the van as the hijacked bus was driven to a remote location at Berenda Slough, a shallow branch of the Chowchilla River where thick brush and isolation provided perfect cover. The children, many of them too young to fully understand what was happening, sat in terrified silence as the only adult they trusted was powerless to protect them. At the slough, the kidnappers had hidden a second van. Both vehicles had been modified for this purpose, their rear windows painted black and their interiors lined with soundproof paneling. One by one, the children were ordered off the bus and into the sweltering darkness of the vans. To prevent leaving footprints that might aid investigators, the kidnappers forced the children to jump from the bus steps directly into the vehicles. Some of the younger ones had to be lifted. Inside the pitch-black vans, children clung to each other, crying softly, while Ed Ray tried desperately to keep them calm despite his own terror. What followed was an 11-hour nightmare journey through the California darkness. The children had no idea where they were being taken or why this was happening to them. Inside the cramped, suffocating vans, temperatures soared and fear multiplied with every passing hour. Some children vomited from motion sickness and heat. Others fell into exhausted sleep, only to wake screaming from nightmares that had become real. Ed Ray moved among them as best he could in the confined space, reassuring them, wiping tears, telling them everything would be okay, even as he feared the worst himself. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the van stopped. The children were led out into the darkness and found themselves at what would later be identified as the California Rock and Gravel Quarry in Livermore, more than 100 miles from Chowchilla. There, in the pre-dawn hours, they were forced to descend a narrow hole in the ground, climbing down a ladder into what appeared to be some kind of buried chamber. What awaited them below was a buried moving van, an 8 by 16-foot metal coffin that had been prepared for their arrival. The kidnappers had outfitted it with a few mattresses, some water, cereal, peanut butter, and bread. Crude toilets had been fashioned in the wheel wells. 2 ventilation pipes provided the only connection to the world above. Once all 27 captives were inside, the kidnappers sealed the entrance and piled heavy debris on top, including 2 industrial batteries that would prove crucial in the hours to come. For the children, trapped in this underground prison, time lost all meaning. The darkness was absolute, broken only by the thin beams of light filtering through the ventilation pipes during daylight hours. The air grew thick and stale as 27 people breathed the limited oxygen that seeped through those narrow tubes. Younger children wept continuously, while older ones tried to be brave, their faces masked with dirt and dried tears. The temperature inside the buried trailer fluctuated wildly, scorching during the day when the California sun baked the earth above them and dropping uncomfortably at night. Inside that metal coffin, children huddled together on the thin mattresses, some too terrified to sleep, and others too exhausted to stay awake. The smell grew unbearable as the hours passed, a mixture of sweat, fear, and the inadequate sanitation facilities. Some children developed claustrophobia that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Others became convinced they were going to die there, that no one would ever find them, that the adults who had taken them had simply buried them and left them to suffocate slowly in the darkness. Ed Ray kept talking to them, kept them as calm as possible, telling stories and cracking jokes even as his own terror threatened to overwhelm him. He organized bathroom schedules to maintain some semblance of order and dignity. He rationed the water and food, not knowing how long they might be trapped, and he never stopped looking for a way out. He knew that whoever had done this would likely not let them go willingly, and he understood with terrible clarity that if they were going to survive, they would have to save themselves. The children themselves showed remarkable courage in those dark hours. Jennifer Brown Hyde, who was 9 years old at the time, would later describe feeling like an animal going to the slaughterhouse when she was herded into the vans. Yet she and the other children held onto hope, supporting each other through the ordeal. 6-year-old Larry Park would later say that when he finally returned home to his parents' arms, he finally felt safe again, words that conveyed the depths of terror he had experienced in that buried tomb. Meanwhile, above ground, Chowchilla was descending into chaos. When the school bus failed to arrive and parents began calling frantically, police launched an immediate search. By evening, the bus had been found, abandoned, and hidden in the drainage ditch at Berenda Slough, but there was no trace of the children or Ed Ray. Phone lines to the Chowchilla Police Department became jammed as media from across the nation picked up the story. The kidnappers, who had planned to call in a $5 million ransom demand, found themselves unable to get through. Exhausted from the operation, they decided to call later and fell asleep. While the kidnappers slept, Ed Ray and the older children were working. Michael Marshall, at 14, the oldest of the captives, had been trying to stack mattresses to reach the metal plate that sealed them inside. For hours, they pushed and strained, and finally, after nearly 16 hours underground, they managed to shift the plate enough to start digging through the debris above. What they emerged into must have felt like being reborn. The fresh air, the sunlight, the simple fact of being alive. Ed Ray led the children to find help, and they were soon discovered by a quarry worker who could barely believe what he was seeing. Within hours, the children were reunited with their families in scenes of tearful joy that were broadcast around the world. The investigation moved swiftly after that. The buried van was traced to the California Rock and Gravel Quarry, which was owned by Frederick Newhall Woods III. His son, 24-year-old Frederick Newhall Woods IV, quickly became a suspect, along with his friends and business partners, brothers James and Richard Schoenfeld. All three young men came from wealthy California families. None of them had any apparent financial need. Yet they had spent months planning this crime, believing that a $5 million ransom would fund lives of unlimited luxury. Within 2 weeks of the kidnapping, all three men were in custody. Richard Schoenfeld surrendered voluntarily, accompanied by his attorney. James Schoenfeld and Frederick Woods were captured separately. Found at the Woods family estate was a rough draft of the ransom note that was never delivered, along with evidence of the elaborate planning that had gone into the scheme. The trial that followed revealed the depths of the kidnappers' callousness. They had chosen children specifically because they believed parents would pay anything to get them back. They had buried the moving van 8 months before the kidnapping, knowing that they would trap more than 24 children inside. They had provided minimal provisions and inadequate ventilation, seemingly indifferent to whether their captives lived or died during the ordeal. All three men were convicted of kidnapping with intent to do bodily harm and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But in 1980, a court ruling changed their sentences to life with the possibility of parole. Over the decades that followed, each man would eventually be released. Richard Schoenfeld was paroled in 2012. His brother James followed in 2015. And in 2022, Frederick Woods, considered the mastermind of the operation, was granted parole and released from prison at the age of 70. For the survivors, the ordeal was far from over when they climbed out of that buried van. In the days following their rescue, they were celebrated as heroes. A Los Angeles organization even took them to Disneyland in an effort to help them recover. But behind closed doors, the children were struggling with trauma that would take decades to understand. In the mid-1970s, the field of childhood trauma psychiatry was still in its infancy. The prevailing belief among experts was that children were resilient, that they would simply bounce back from disturbing experiences and move on with their lives. One mental health professional predicted that only one of the 26 children would be emotionally affected by the kidnapping. This prediction proved catastrophically wrong. Dr. Lenore Terr, a psychiatrist who began studying the Chowchilla survivors in November 1976, found that every single child was suffering. Parents were terrified because 5 months after the incident, they could still hear their children screaming in their sleep. Many developed fears and phobias of things connected to the experience, including cars, the dark, and even hippies, because the kidnappers had long hair. One child shot a Japanese tourist with a BB gun when the tourist's car broke down in front of his home, mistaking the stranger for a threat. The trauma manifested in different ways for different children, but none escaped unscathed. At the time, parents were actually told not to enter their children's rooms when they had nightmares. The prevailing wisdom suggested that doing so would somehow reward the behavior. Jennifer Brown Hyde later recalled that she started sleepwalking immediately after returning home, coming into her parents' room in shock, telling them that they were killing her. The nightmares were vivid and terrifying. Replays of the ordeal mixed with imagined horrors that the children's traumatized minds could not distinguish from reality. In several cases, Dr. Terr found, children had dreamed of their own deaths, of being lined up and shot, or being killed by the kidnappers on the bus. These were not the nightmares of normal childhood fears, but rather the manifestations of what Terr called trauma-shattered minds, psyches that had come to expect death because they had been so close to it. The children developed a pervasive sense that the future was dangerous and unpredictable, that bad things could happen at any moment without warning. Dr. Terr's research with the Chowchilla victims would become seminal in the field of childhood psychiatry, proving definitively that children are not immune to trauma and that the effects can persist long into adulthood. Her work helped establish the understanding that children need prompt and appropriate mental health intervention after traumatic events, a principle that now guides responses to school shootings, natural disasters, and other crises affecting young people. Many of the survivors continued to report symptoms decades later, including substance abuse, depression, and what some described as a compulsion to control others, perhaps a way of reclaiming the power that was stolen from them as children. Mike Marshall, the 14-year-old who helped lead the escape, struggled with blackout drinking and drug use for years as he tried to forget what happened. He has been to rehabilitation at least 7 times, driven by a need to escape memories that refuse to fade. Larry Park, who was just 6 during the kidnapping, found himself constantly replaying the events in his mind for years afterward, fantasizing about ways to punish the men who had terrorized him. Ed Ray, the bus driver who kept 26 children calm through their darkest hours and helped lead their escape, was honored for his heroism. He received a citation for outstanding community service, and in 2015, Chowchilla renamed a local park in his honor. Every February 26th, his birthday, is now celebrated as Edward Ray Day in the town. Ray passed away in May 2012, but he remained close to many of the children he helped save, and they visited him throughout his life to express their gratitude for the man who refused to let them give up hope. The Chowchilla kidnapping transformed how America thinks about child safety. It demonstrated that even in small, sleepy towns, children could be targeted. It led to changes in how schools plan and monitor field trips, and it contributed to the broader cultural shift that would, over the following decades, replace the free-range childhoods of the 1970s with a more vigilant and sometimes fearful approach to parenting. But perhaps most importantly, the case showed that in moments of absolute darkness, ordinary people can find extraordinary courage. 26 children and 1 bus driver, trapped underground with dwindling air and fading hope, refused to accept their fate. They worked together, they kept faith in each other, and they saved themselves. Not everyone who goes missing on a school trip is so fortunate. Just 3 months after the children of Chowchilla escaped their underground prison, another teenager would vanish during a school outing, and her fate would prove far more mysterious. On October 8, 1976, 16-year-old Teresa Lynn Gibson, known to everyone as Trenny, woke up in her family home in Knoxville, Tennessee, expecting an ordinary Friday. She was a junior at Bearden High School, a quiet girl with dreams of studying landscape architecture at the University of Tennessee. That morning, despite dreary weather that had brought rain overnight, a field trip was still scheduled for her horticulture class, and the destination was the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Trenny had expressed reservations about the trip to her father in the days leading up to it. She wasn't particularly dressed for hiking when she left that morning, apparently confident that the weather would cancel the outing. But the trip proceeded as planned, and around 40 students, along with their teacher, Wayne Dunlap, boarded a bus for the drive to Clingman's Dome, one of the most visited spots in the Smokies and the highest point in Tennessee. The plan was straightforward enough. The students would hike approximately 1.8 miles from the Clingman's Dome parking area down the Forney Ridge Trail to Andrews Bald, a high-elevation meadow popular with tourists and naturalists alike. They would then turn around and hike back. It was not an especially difficult trail, though there were some steep sections and drop-offs along the way. The students separated into smaller groups as they made their way along the trail, which was common practice at the time. Trenny was seen with friends for most of the hike, but at some point during the return journey, she pulled ahead of her companions. According to witnesses, some of her friends stopped to rest about half a mile from the parking area, but Trenny kept walking. She seemed to be in a hurry, one classmate later recalled, though no one knew why. She told them she would meet them at the bus. That was the last confirmed sighting of Trenny Lynn Gibson. When the students regrouped at the bus around 3:30 that afternoon, she was not among them. A search of the immediate area turned up nothing. By evening, with darkness falling and weather deteriorating, the search was called off for the night. The following days brought one of the most intensive search efforts in the history of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Half a dozen dog teams were deployed, including bloodhounds and German shepherds trained for tracking. Helicopters scoured the terrain from above, though fall foliage made it difficult to see the ground clearly. Hundreds of searchers combed the trails and the wilderness beyond, looking for any trace of the missing teenager. The search involved park rangers, local volunteers, and eventually federal resources as the days stretched on without any sign of Trenny. Her family rushed to the mountains as soon as they learned of her disappearance. Trenny's father, Robert Gibson, had been on a business trip to Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and flew home immediately when he received the terrible news. The family arrived at the search staging area around midnight, bringing clothing that Trenny had recently worn to give scent to the tracking dogs. They waited through the long night as rain hampered the search efforts, hoping against hope that their daughter would be found safe. The search dogs provided some of the most puzzling clues. They picked up Trenny's scent at various points along the Appalachian Trail, which intersects with the Forney Ridge Trail near Clingman's Dome. One dog followed the scent for approximately 1.5 miles before losing it at Clingman's Dome Road. Another detected her scent along a different section of trail toward Collins Gap. The implication was troubling, suggesting that Trenny might have left the trail system and perhaps even reached a road where she could have been picked up by a vehicle. The dog's behavior suggested something more sinister than a simple hiking accident. If Trenny had simply gotten lost or fallen, her scent trail would likely have led to her body, or at least continued into the wilderness. Instead, the trail leading to the road raised the terrible possibility that someone had been waiting for her, that she had been taken away in a vehicle while searchers were still organizing their efforts. This theory gained traction as days passed without any physical evidence being found in the park itself. Searchers also found what appeared to be footprints matching Trenny's blue Adidas sneakers on sections of the Appalachian Trail. Some prints were found heading toward Double Spring Shelter, but they eventually disappeared. Whether Trenny had walked those paths herself, or whether the prints belonged to someone else entirely, was never definitively established. The rugged terrain and the number of hikers using the trails made it impossible to say with certainty which tracks belonged to the missing girl. The weather complicated everything. Heavy fog and rain had moved through the area on the day of the field trip and continued in the days that followed, potentially washing away footprints and other evidence that might have provided crucial clues. Helicopters were grounded for much of the first day of the official search, and even when they could fly, the thick canopy of autumn foliage made it nearly impossible to spot anything on the ground below. Search teams reported feeling like they were looking for a needle in a haystack, except the haystack was more than 500,000 acres of dense wilderness. By October 12th, just 4 days after Trenny's disappearance, the chief ranger told reporters he was almost certain that Trenny was not in the park. This was a remarkable statement given the vastness of the wilderness and the limited time that had passed, and it fueled speculation that something other than a hiking accident had befallen the teenager. The intensive search was scaled back, though periodic efforts continued for weeks. Investigators pursued multiple leads. Trenny's parents reported that a young man had once attempted to break into their home and had subsequently threatened their daughter. This individual was investigated, but apparently cleared. Some students whispered that Trenny might have run off with someone, though no one could identify who that might be. The FBI was called in to interview students at Bearden High School, searching for any clue that might explain what happened to their classmate. Theories about Trenny's fate have proliferated over the decades. The most prosaic explanation is that she became disoriented, wandered off the trail, and perished from exposure or a fall somewhere in the wilderness. The Smoky Mountains are vast and unforgiving, and despite intensive searches, it would be entirely possible for remains to go undiscovered in the dense vegetation and rugged terrain. Against this theory is the fact that Trenny was so close to the parking area when she was last seen, and the trail back was well marked and heavily traveled. Others believe that Trenny was abducted, perhaps by someone who spotted her on the trail and followed her to a point where she could be grabbed without witnesses. The scent trail leading to the road lends some support to this theory, as does the speed with which the ranger concluded she was no longer in the park. If Trenny was taken by someone in a vehicle, she could have been miles away before the search even began. Some have even suggested that Trenny staged her own disappearance, though this seems inconsistent with everything known about her life. She was by all accounts a good student with no significant problems, looking forward to college and a career. Her family was loving and stable. There was no obvious reason for her to run away, and every reason for her to stay. What is certain is that Trenny Lynn Gibson has never been found. Her case remains open with the National Park Service, one of 4 active missing persons cases in the Great Smoky Mountains. Her family was devastated by her loss. Her parents eventually divorced, unable to withstand the strain that such tragedy places on a marriage. A memorial at Bearden High School keeps her memory alive for students who were not yet born when she vanished. The desk where Trenny once sat remained empty for weeks after her disappearance, a silent reminder to her classmates that one of their own had stepped off a trail and into oblivion. Some who knew her still speak of seeing that empty chair, of the way it seemed to embody the uncertainty that surrounded her fate. Was she ever coming back? Was she still alive somewhere? Were they sitting in class while she lay injured in the forest, waiting for help that never came? Her classmate Kim Pouncey, who knew Trenny from their time together in the school's smoking pit and from Spanish class, remembers coming to school on the Monday after the disappearance and learning that her friend was missing. The sight of Trenny's empty desk haunted her. She later described it as a ghostly thing, a physical representation of absence and uncertainty. For weeks, neither teachers nor students knew whether that desk would ever be filled again. FBI agents showed up at Bearden High School in the days following the disappearance, interviewing students in the principal's office about everything they knew about Trenny. Some classmates speculated that she might have run off with someone, though no one could identify who that might have been or why. Others wondered about a young man who had once tried to break into the Gibson home and had subsequently threatened Trenny after her mother shot him during the attempted burglary. Investigators pursued this lead, but apparently found nothing that connected him to her disappearance. The single adult chaperone on the field trip, horticulture teacher Wayne Dunlap, came under scrutiny as well. Parents and investigators questioned whether 40 students should have been supervised by only one teacher on a hike through potentially dangerous terrain. Dunlap reportedly kept the destination of the trip secret beforehand to prevent anyone from following them, a detail that struck some as unusual and raised questions that were never satisfactorily answered. Nearly 50 years later, those questions remain unanswered. The Great Smoky Mountains, beautiful and indifferent, keep their secrets well. Hikers still walk the Forney Ridge Trail to Andrews Bald, passing the spot where Trenny Gibson was last seen. Most of them know nothing of the girl who vanished there in 1976, who walked ahead of her friends and never looked back. But for those who remember, every hike through those mountains carries the weight of mystery, the knowledge that beneath the beauty lurks something unknown and possibly dangerous. Almost 3 decades after Trenny Gibson disappeared into the mists of the Smoky Mountains, another student would vanish under circumstances that would become one of the most publicized missing persons cases in American history. But unlike Trenny, this young woman's fate would eventually be revealed, and the truth would prove more horrific than anyone had imagined. On May 26, 2005, 18-year-old Natalee Holloway arrived in Aruba with 124 of her fellow graduates from Mountain Brook High School in Alabama. The trip was an unofficial celebration of their graduation, a 5-day vacation to the Caribbean island that had become a popular destination for American tourists. 7 chaperones accompanied the group, though, as one organizer later explained, they were not expected to monitor the students' every move. These were young adults, after all, high school graduates on the cusp of independence, and the trip was meant to be a final hurrah before they scattered to colleges and careers across the country. Natalee was the kind of student every parent hopes for. She had graduated with honors, was active in school activities, and had a full scholarship waiting for her at the University of Alabama. She was close to her family, particularly her mother, Beth Twitty, who had raised her after divorcing Natalee's father, Dave Holloway, when Natalee was young. By all accounts, she was responsible and level-headed, the last person anyone would expect to end up at the center of an international mystery. For the first 4 days of the trip, everything went as planned. The students spent their days on sun-drenched beaches and their nights in the pulse-thumping nightclubs that catered to the tourist trade. According to some reports, the atmosphere was one of wild partying, with plenty of alcohol flowing despite the students' youth. The Holiday Inn where they stayed reportedly told the group they would not be welcome to return the following year due to the behavior of some students. On the night of May 29th, the last full night of the trip, Natalee and her friends went to Carlos and Charlie's, a popular restaurant and nightclub in the town of Oranjestad. At some point during the evening, Natalee encountered a young man named Joran van der Sloot, a Dutch citizen who lived on the island. Van der Sloot, then 17 years old, was a regular at the clubs that catered to tourists. By most accounts, he was charming and good-looking, exactly the kind of young man who might catch the attention of a girl looking for adventure on her last night of vacation. What happened next would be debated, investigated, and speculated upon for nearly 2 decades. According to witnesses, Natalee was last seen leaving Carlos and Charlie's in the early morning hours of May 30th, getting into a car with Vander Sloot and 2 brothers named Deepak and Satish Kalpo. Her friends assumed she would return to the hotel, but when Natalee failed to appear for the bus to the airport later that morning, alarm bells began to ring. Beth Twitty received the call every parent dreads and immediately flew to Aruba. Within hours of her arrival, she was at the Vander Sloot residence, confronting the young man who had last been seen with her daughter. Vander Sloot claimed that he had dropped Natalee off at her hotel and that she had been approached by a security guard. He denied any knowledge of what happened to her after that. What followed was an investigation that would span years, cross international borders, and reveal the staggering challenges of seeking justice in a foreign country. Vander Sloot and the Kalpo brothers were arrested and released multiple times over the following months. Vander Sloot's story changed repeatedly, but no physical evidence tied him conclusively to Natalee's disappearance. Despite massive search efforts that included the FBI, Dutch soldiers, hundreds of volunteers, and sophisticated detection equipment, no trace of Natalee was ever found. The case became a media sensation, unlike almost anything that had come before. Evening newscasts led with live reports from Aruba night after night. Natalee's smiling face became ubiquitous, and her disappearance spawned countless books, documentaries, and television specials. Critics noted that the intense coverage seemed to be an example of what some called missing white woman syndrome, the tendency of media to focus disproportionately on cases involving young, attractive, white female victims, while similar cases involving minorities received far less attention. But for Beth Twitty, there was no media theory, only a missing daughter and an agonizing search for answers. Over the years, Vander Sloot gave multiple conflicting statements about what happened to Natalee. At various times, he claimed she collapsed on the beach, that she was buried under the foundation of a house, that he sold her into sexual slavery, and that his father helped dispose of her body. None of these claims could be verified, and each seemed calculated to torment the Holloway family while keeping the truth just out of reach. In 2012, Natalee was officially declared dead by an Alabama judge, though her body had never been found. By then, Vander Sloot had proven himself capable of far more than teenage lies. On May 30th, 2010, exactly 5 years to the day after Natalee disappeared, Vander Sloot murdered 21-year-old Stephanie Flores in a Lima, Peru hotel room. He beat her to death after she apparently discovered information on his laptop linking him to the Holloway case. Vander Sloot was convicted of the murder and sentenced to 28 years in a Peruvian prison. But even from prison, Vander Sloot found ways to profit from his infamy. In 2010, he contacted Beth Holloway through intermediaries, offering to reveal the location of Natalee's body in exchange for $250,000. Beth agreed to pay a portion of the money, desperately hoping for closure, but the information Vander Sloot provided was worthless. He fled to Peru before he could be arrested, and a federal grand jury in Alabama indicted him for wire fraud and extortion. It was this indictment that finally brought a measure of truth, if not justice. In June 2023, Vander Sloot was temporarily extradited from Peru to the United States to face the extortion charges. As part of a plea deal, he agreed to provide information about what had actually happened to Natalee Holloway on that night in 2005. On October 18th, 2023, in a federal courtroom in Birmingham, Alabama, Vandersloot finally confessed. He told investigators that after leaving the nightclub, he and Natalee had walked on the beach where they began kissing. When Natalee refused his sexual advances, Vandersloot flew into a rage. He grabbed a cinder block and struck her in the head repeatedly until her face, in his own words, collapsed. He then dragged her body into the ocean and left her there. The confession was verified through a polygraph test and extensive investigation. Prosecutors said they could find no credible evidence to contradict Vandersloot's account. After 18 years of lies and misdirection, the truth was finally known, though it was a truth too horrible for any parent to bear. Beth Holloway was in the courtroom that day. When the hearing concluded, she addressed reporters outside the federal building. Her words were simple and devastating. "As far as I am concerned, it is over. Joran Vandersloot is no longer the suspect in my daughter's murder. He is the killer." Vandersloot was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison for the extortion, to be served concurrently with his Peruvian sentence. Due to the statute of limitations in Aruba, he could not be charged with Natalee's murder there. In a cruel twist of law, the man who confessed to killing an American teenager on her graduation trip will likely spend less time in prison than many people who commit far less horrifying crimes. Natalee Holloway's case transformed how many American families think about travel, particularly for young people. Her mother founded the International Safe Travels Foundation and opened a resource center for families of missing persons. The case also prompted renewed attention to the safety of students on school trips, graduation celebrations, and other group activities where supervision may be minimal and risks may be underestimated. Natalee never got to attend the University of Alabama on her scholarship. She never got to experience college life, fall in love, build a career, or have children of her own. All of those possibilities were stolen from her on a beach in Aruba by a young man who could not accept the word no. Her remains have never been recovered, claimed forever by the Caribbean Sea. While Natalee Holloway's case dominated international headlines, another student disappeared much closer to home under circumstances that remain unsolved to this day. On June 4th, 2010, 7-year-old Kyron Horman put on his favorite black t-shirt, the one with CSI printed in green letters across the front, and headed to Skyline Elementary School in Portland, Oregon. It was the day of the school science fair, and Kyron was excited to show off his project about red-eyed tree frogs. His stepmother, Terry Horman, drove him to school that morning and walked with him through the science fair displays. The last known photograph of Kyron shows him standing proudly next to his project, a happy second grader enjoying a special day at school. Terry would later tell investigators that she last saw Kyron around 8:45 that morning, walking down the hallway toward his classroom. But Kyron never made it to class. His teacher marked him absent that day, apparently assuming he had stayed home sick or had an appointment. No one realized anything was wrong until 3:30 that afternoon, when Kyron failed to get off the school bus at his regular stop. When Terry called the school to ask about him, she learned that no one had seen him all day. What followed was the largest criminal investigation in Oregon history. More than 1,300 searchers scoured the area around Skyline Elementary, including nearby Forest Park and Sauvie Island. Helicopters flew grid patterns overhead. K-9 units tracked scents that led nowhere. The FBI joined local and state police in pursuing every lead, but Kyron seemed to have vanished into thin air. From the beginning, suspicion centered on Terry Horman. Her timeline for the morning of June 4th contained gaps that she could not satisfactorily explain. She claimed to have left the school around 8:45, gone to 2 different stores, and then spent time at a gym before returning home. But witnesses reported seeing her white truck in various locations at times that did not match her account, and cell phone data suggested she had been in areas far from where she claimed to be. The investigation took a dramatic turn in late June when Kyron's father, Kyron Horman, filed for divorce and obtained a restraining order against Terry. Through his attorneys, Kyron revealed that months before Kyron's disappearance, Terry had allegedly approached their landscaper and offered him money to kill Kyron. The landscaper, Rodolfo Sanchez, had reported this to police, who had wired him for a subsequent conversation with Terry. Though the sting operation did not produce evidence sufficient for an arrest, the allegation cast a dark shadow over Terry and her relationship with the entire family. Terry also failed 2 polygraph examinations regarding her knowledge of what happened to Kyron. Friends who had supported her initially began to distance themselves. One close friend, Dita Spiker, became a person of interest after investigators learned she had been unaccounted for during a 3-hour period on the day Kyron disappeared. Spiker was working as a gardener at a home on Germantown Road, not far from the school, and she denied having left the property. Despite years of investigation, grand jury proceedings, and massive public interest, no charges have ever been filed in Kyron's case. Terry Horman has consistently denied any involvement in her stepson's disappearance and has never been arrested. In 2016, she appeared on the Dr. Phil television program and proclaimed her innocence, telling the host that she had nothing to hide and that she believed Kyron had been kidnapped by a stranger. Kyron's biological mother, Desiree Young, has never stopped fighting to find her son. Every year, she organizes fundraising events to support the investigation and keep public attention focused on the case. She has been vocal in her belief that Terry is responsible for whatever happened to Kyron, and she has pushed for continued investigation even as years have turned into decades. In May 2025, as the 15th anniversary of Kyron's disappearance approached, investigators announced a renewed effort to solve the case. Working with the FBI, the Multnomah County Sheriff's Office has been digitizing thousands of pages of documents, photographs, and evidence, hoping that modern software and analytical tools might reveal patterns or connections that were missed in the original investigation. A $50,000 reward remains available for information leading to the resolution of the case. Kyron Horman would be 22 years old today if he is still alive. Age-progressed photographs show what he might look like as a young adult, though whether those images bear any resemblance to the reality is unknown. His case serves as a haunting reminder that not all disappearances involve strangers. Sometimes the danger is much closer to home. The annual car wash fundraiser organized by Kyron's family continues to draw supporters, a testament to a community that refuses to forget a little boy who loved science and wore a CSI shirt on the day he vanished. His mother speaks of him in the present tense, describing him as 7 years old, frozen in time at the age when she last saw him. "I feel like we are frozen in time in 2010, she has said, and it is hard to really move past that. The circumstances of Kyron's disappearance bear some similarity to another case that would unfold the following year on the opposite side of the country, high in the mountains of Southern California. On July 19, 1991, 12-year-old Jared Michael Negrete set out on his first overnight backpacking trip with his Boy Scout troop. The destination was Mount San Gorgonio, the highest peak in Southern California at over 11,500 feet. For a boy who loved the outdoors, it should have been the adventure of a lifetime. Jared was a shy but friendly 8th grader from El Monte, California. He had recently joined the Boy Scouts, drawn by the promise of camping trips and wilderness exploration. He was slightly overweight, wearing glasses with brown plastic frames, and this was his first experience with serious mountain hiking. The troop, consisting of about 15 boys and their adult leader from a local Mormon congregation, had driven from El Monte to begin their ascent. The climb to the summit of San Gorgonio is challenging even for experienced hikers. The trail gains thousands of feet in elevation over several miles, with the air growing thinner and the terrain more demanding as climbers approach the peak. For Jared, who was not in peak physical condition and had limited hiking experience, the ascent proved exhausting. As the troop made its way toward the summit in the late afternoon, Jared began to fall behind. He was tired, struggling to keep pace with the other boys. According to later accounts, the scout leader made a decision that would have devastating consequences. He told Jared to sit down and wait on the trail while the rest of the group completed their hike to the summit. They would pick him up on the way back down. It was a decision that violated basic wilderness safety principles, which dictate that groups should stay together and that the slowest members should be placed in the middle of the hiking order rather than left alone. But it was made, and Jared sat down to wait. He was last seen at approximately 6 in the evening by another hiker, a Santa Ana firefighter who encountered Jared on the trail. The firefighter warned the boy about straying from marked paths and told him to stay where he was. Then the firefighter continued on his way, assuming that Jared's group would return for him shortly. When the scout troop returned to the spot where they had left Jared, he was gone. The scout leader conducted a brief search before hiking approximately 12 miles in the darkness to reach a ranger station and report the disappearance. By midnight, with temperatures dropping into the low 50s, search and rescue operations began. Over the following days, hundreds of searchers combed a 130 square mile area of the San Gorgonio wilderness. They found footprints believed to match Jared's high-top sneakers at around the 10,000-foot level. They found beef jerky wrappers and candy wrappers that Jared was known to have been carrying. And on July 27th, 8 days after the disappearance, they found Jared's disposable Kodak camera. The camera was discovered about 45 feet off the Vivian Creek Trail, in an area near where Jared had last been seen. When the film was developed, it contained 12 photographs. Most showed landscapes taken before Jared disappeared, typical snapshots of a boy enjoying his mountain adventure. But the last photograph on the roll was different. It was a close-up of Jared's own face, showing only his eyes and nose. The camera flash had activated, suggesting the picture was taken in low light or darkness. The image is haunting, a final record of a boy alone in the wilderness, perhaps trying to signal for help, or simply documenting his situation in the hope that someone would find the camera. The expression in his visible features is difficult to read, but the circumstances suggest fear and desperation. Despite the discovery of the camera and other personal effects, Jared himself was never found. The search was officially called off on August 4th, 1991, after 16 days. Authorities concluded that his chances of survival were almost nil and presumed him dead. His family held a memorial service on September 7th, attended by approximately 500 people, including fellow scouts and community members. The question of what happened to Jared Negrete has never been definitively answered. The most likely explanation is that he became disoriented after being left alone wandered off the trail, and perished from a fall or exposure somewhere in the rugged wilderness. The terrain around San Gorgonio includes steep rock walls, dense manzanita fields, and treacherous drop-offs that could easily conceal remains. Despite periodic searches over the years, including efforts by amateur investigators who have hiked the area looking for clues, no trace of Jared has ever been found beyond what searchers discovered in those first days. His uncle, devastated by the loss, blamed the church and the Boy Scouts for what he believed was their negligence in leaving a 12-year-old alone on a mountain. He refused to set foot in the church again and maintained until his death that institutional failures had cost his nephew's life. Jared's parents, Felipe and Linda Negrete, eventually moved from El Monte to Walnut, California, and adopted 2 additional children, though they emphasized that no child could replace the son they had lost. 10 years after Jared's disappearance, his father Felipe hiked the trail to San Gorgonio summit, retracing his son's final journey. He described feeling Jared's presence during the hike, a bittersweet experience that provided some emotional closure even as the fundamental mystery remained unsolved. The camera with its haunting final image remains the most enduring artifact of Jared Negrete's brief life. That photograph of his eyes and nose, captured in darkness on a mountainside where no one could hear his calls for help, is a reminder of how quickly an outdoor adventure can turn deadly, and how vulnerable children are when the adults responsible for them fail to keep them safe. Of all the cases of students who never returned from trips, perhaps none carries the weight of national tragedy and political significance like what happened on September 26, 2014, in the Mexican state of Guerrero. On that night, 43 male students from the Ayotzinapa Rural Teachers College vanished after being stopped by police, and their disappearance would become one of Mexico's most infamous human rights cases, a symbol of the corruption, violence, and impunity that plagued the nation. The Ayotzinapa Rural Teachers College, located in the town of Tixtla, was a place with a long history of left-wing activism. Founded in 1926, the all-male school trained students from poor rural communities to become teachers. Many of its students came from indigenous backgrounds and held progressive political views. They had a tradition of protesting government policies they opposed and of commandeering buses to transport themselves to demonstrations, a practice that was illegal but widely tolerated. On the evening of September 26th, more than 100 students from the college traveled to the city of Iguala, about 40 miles away. They had multiple purposes. Some accounts suggest they were planning to solicit donations for transportation costs to Mexico City, where a march commemorating the 1968 Tlatelolco student massacre was scheduled for October 2nd. Others indicate they intended to commandeer buses for that trip, as they had done many times before. What the students may not have known was that Iguala was effectively controlled by a drug cartel called Guerreros Unidos, or United Warriors. The mayor of Iguala, Jose Luis Abarca, and his wife Maria de Los Angeles Pineda Villa had deep connections to the criminal organization. Pineda Villa's brothers were reportedly high-ranking members of the cartel, and the couple allegedly used their political positions to facilitate drug trafficking and money laundering. That evening, Pineda Villa was hosting a public event at the town plaza, and local authorities were apparently determined to prevent any disruption. When the students arrived in Iguala aboard several buses, municipal police intercepted them. What followed was a night of violence that left 6 people dead, dozens injured, and 43 students missing. According to the official investigation conducted under President Enrique Peña Nieto's administration, the students were taken into custody by Iguala police and transferred to officers from the neighboring town of Chowchilla. These officers then allegedly handed the students over to Guerreros Unidos, who killed them and burned their bodies at a garbage dump near Chowchilla. The remains were then supposedly dumped in a nearby river. This account, which Mexican authorities called the historical truth, was almost immediately challenged by independent investigators, families of the victims, and human rights organizations. The Inter-American Commission on Human Rights assembled a team of international experts who spent years examining the evidence. Their findings were damning. The experts concluded that the government's narrative was scientifically impossible. Fire experts testified that the garbage dump fire could not have reached temperatures high enough to consume 43 bodies in the manner described. Evidence suggested that the crime scene had been tampered with, possibly by authorities themselves. Crucial records, including surveillance footage from the area, had disappeared or been destroyed. In 2022, a Truth Commission established by President Andrés Manuel López Obrador released a report concluding that the disappearance of the 43 students was a state crime, involving not just local police, but also state and federal authorities, and potentially the Mexican military. The commission reported that 6 of the students were allegedly kept alive in a warehouse for several days after the initial abduction, then turned over to a local army commander who ordered them killed. This revelation was shocking even by the grim standards of Mexican organized crime. It suggested that soldiers, who were supposed to protect citizens, had participated in the execution of students whose only crime was attending a teacher's college with a history of political activism. As of 2025, the remains of only 3 of the 43 students have been identified through DNA analysis. The rest remain missing, their final resting places unknown. The families of the victims have marched in the streets of Mexico City every month for more than a decade, demanding truth and justice. Their signs and banners carry the faces of their sons, young men who set out one September evening to travel to a protest and were never seen again. Multiple arrests have been made in connection with the case, including police officers, gang members, and even Jesus Murillo Karam, the former Attorney General who oversaw the original investigation and is accused of creating a false narrative to cover up what really happened. In 2025, a former judge was arrested for the disappearance of surveillance recordings that might have provided crucial evidence, but for the families, no amount of arrests can bring back their children. The 43 missing students of Ayotzinapa have become martyrs, symbols of all the tens of thousands who have disappeared during Mexico's drug war. Their faces appear on murals and protest signs throughout the country. Their names are read aloud at memorials. And the question of what happened to them, where their bodies lie, and whether anyone will ever be held fully accountable haunts Mexico like an open wound that refuses to heal. The cases we have explored tonight span decades and continents, from the sun-baked valleys of California to the misty peaks of Tennessee, from the beaches of Aruba to the violent streets of Guerrero. Each involves young people who set out on journeys that were supposed to be adventures, opportunities to learn and grow and create memories that would last a lifetime. Instead, those journeys ended in tragedy, in questions that may never be answered, and in grief that will never fully heal. The children of Chowchilla were fortunate. Through courage, teamwork, and no small amount of luck, they escaped from their underground prison and returned to their families. But their experience left scars that persist to this day, proof that trauma does not simply vanish because a child is young and supposedly resilient. Trenny Gibson walked ahead of her friends on a mountain trail and stepped into a mystery that has endured for nearly 50 years. Natalee Holloway trusted the wrong person on the wrong night and paid with her life. Kyron Horman vanished from his school science fair and may never be found. Jared Negrete was left alone on a mountainside by adults who should have known better. And 43 young men in Mexico were swallowed by a system of corruption and violence that treats human life as disposable. These stories remind us that the world is not always safe, that field trips and school outings and graduation celebrations carry risks that we do not always adequately consider. They remind us that children depend on adults to protect them, and that when we fail in that duty, the consequences can be devastating and permanent. If you found this video meaningful, please consider giving it a like and subscribing to the channel. Your support helps us continue sharing these important stories. Until next time, stay safe and keep those you love close.